Hi everyone, welcome to lecture guide number 4, which is on the Northern Renaissance, 15th century, so the 1400s. And we'll start with just a little bit of clarification about this. You'll be hearing a lot, as you started to hear last week, about the Renaissance. Literally means rebirth, as we covered. However, there is the Italian Renaissance. Obviously, it takes place in Italy, in these key centers, Rome and Florence, and to a lesser extent, Milan. And then later on in the quarter, we'll see it taking place also in northern areas of Italy. And then you also have the Renaissance taking place in northern countries of Western Europe. And so what we mean when we say the Northern Renaissance, for today's lecture, it means the northern parts of what is today France, and an area known then as Flanders, which is contemporary Belgium. And then later on, when we come back to the Northern Renaissance, we will add in the countries that are today Germany and the Netherlands in there. And it's slightly different than the Italian Renaissance for one big reason. So let's cover the context first. Even though our first work of art, by the way, is a kind of late Gothic, early Renaissance work from France. And the big difference in the context is that while the Italians are very interested in classical works of art and emulating classical styles, as we'll see in next week's lecture, in the Northern Renaissance, they're not so interested in Greece and certainly not the art. They're interested in the philosophy to some degree, but not the art so much. And their style, their period style, looks a little bit different because of this. However, the other key features of the context, as we talked about last week, are the same. We have a slow deterioration of the feudal system in Western Europe being replaced by mercantilism and the middle moneyed class of merchants and bankers who are the primary patrons for the arts. And with this rise of this middle class, of course, comes the rise of humanistic ideas about the importance of this world and perfecting ourselves and those around us. So, for the large part, the context of the Northern Renaissance is much the same as that in Italy, and we've already covered that next week. Just take out of the equation the interest in the classical Greek and Roman styles that the Italians really like, because in the North, that's less important to them, as I've said. So we'll pick up the period style and what are the components of the period style in the Northern Renaissance in a moment. But we start with a work of art that kind of hovers in between late Gothic, or what was known as the International Gothic style, and these newly found interest in naturalism that run concurrently with the rise of humanism. And the first work, which you see up here on the screen now, is an illuminated manuscript known as the Très Riche Heures, or the Very Sumptuous Hours, created by a workshop of the Limbourg brothers in the area today that is basically northern France. It was created for an aristocrat, and so this is still part of the feudal system by and large. And so components of this work are very much in the old Gothic style, here particularly what was known as the International Gothic style. Before I get to that, let me explain to you what this type of illuminated manuscript was, and you can find out more details about this in your text reading. Books of Hours were illuminated manuscripts that were composed and organized according to the calendar and the zodiac sign. And so usually 2 pages are devoted to a couple of months of the year, and alongside of the pictures, as you see here, were also text drawn from various parts of the Bible that were keyed into particular types of rituals or prayers that were associated with particular times of the year. Now, again, this is like those medieval manuscripts, so it's not something that you could go check out in the library or something. This was a book that was created as a luxury item for an incredibly rich patron, the Duke of Berry, for his own private enjoyment, partially religious, but partially, and maybe even a large part of this is that it's a luxury item, something that is a beautiful display of one's wealth and one's, culturedness, and something that sure they would have read, but really it's something to show off to your friends and so forth. So the style here has nothing to do with what we'll look at coming up, frankly, at least in this page. It is of the international Gothic style, meaning that if you were to think of the types of sculptures that you saw on the cathedrals of the Gothic period, or even the imagery that is in the stained glass windows, it looks a lot like that. What I mean by that is these aren't particularly naturalistic figures. I'm going to zoom in close here for a minute. Right, so they don't look all that naturalistic. The figures, the faces, have a little bit of modeling, and those look partially naturalistic. But primarily what the artist is concerned with is creating a visual elegance in the picture. And so everyone's a little elongated. If you start to look at these hands, they're very, very elongated. They don't show much of a body underneath this drapery. The drapery's all in there just to show you these beautiful colors and designs and the types of fabrics that the aristocrats would have worn. And this, of course, fits in with these people. They're not interested in humanism. They all come out of the aristocratic class. They were born into their wealth. They don't need an emphasis on naturalism. They like the idea of, luxury and beauty and decoration. So that's not really all that important, especially in these pages. And what you're looking at here, and this is very common in this text, is a subject that is taken right out of the enjoyment of the upper classes. And a feast scene with a jousting event in the background, right back here, with all these knights and the standards. And then up above that is a scene from the Zodiac telling you which part of the year that we're focused on at this point. What is most interesting for people about this particular illuminated manuscript are rather the pages that are devoted to lower classes, the serf or peasant class, because they alternate back and forth between scenes from the aristocratic class, very much in the international Gothic style, and other scenes that are of the more naturalized depictions of the lower classes and their toils and their labors of the month and what they do while the aristocrats are frankly enjoying themselves. And in these scenes, we see a greater degree of naturalism, and you'll be able to see these details more in your text, and I'll show you a couple of close-ups of this, but you can already tell this. I'm going to get up close here. What we're looking at, basically, is something that should look suspiciously like a Giotto work. Up here in the foreground are women kind of warming themselves in front of the fire after working outside. The architecture is wonky, right? It doesn't look like a real building. He's cut the face off of it, and the perspectival lines are all kinds of wrong. This doesn't look real because he hasn't really learned this stuff yet. And yet the figures themselves start to show bodies underneath those drapery and a greater degree of naturalism to them. The scene over here has, the livestock and the chickens and beehives over here. Up here is someone cutting wood and someone taking things off to market in the far distance. It's kind of a bit different between these two scenes. It's as if the artist decided to represent the aristocratic class in the style that is most associated with aristocrats, that Gothic, very stylized, very decorative, flat style. And then when he turned to represent the lower classes, he was much more interested in the newly emerging naturalism that would have been found in the 15th century, the 1400s. Remember, we've jumped forward almost 100 years from Giotto because, as your text points out, there's not a ton going on in the later half of the 1300s, the 14th century, because of the plague hitting Western Europe. Actually move back here for a minute and show you some close-ups of this so that you can see that greater degree of naturalism, right? So you can see bodies underneath this clothing. You can see a much more much more attention to the naturalistic rendering of the faces. There is no elongation of the body or emphasis on decorative patterning. We're trying to show them doing what they're doing. Now, with that being said, you can probably tell as well, they're pulling up their dresses, something that no aristocrat would ever do, in showing their undergarments. This is a way, frankly, for the aristocrats to poke a little bit of fun at the lack of manners and decorum of the lower classes, who, of course, they are controlling and ruling over. This is the general program for this entire beautiful manuscript. We see again a couple of these pages. Left, aristocrats going out for a hunt, all dressed elegantly, all on these, incredibly stylized horses. They don't look anything like a real horse. No one's bodies really show underneath this drapery. Everything's been turned into a decorative patterning. Same thing over here on the right-hand side if you were to look at this gorgeous castle in which these aristocrats live in. But if you look at the foreground of this, and I'll get us in here a little closer on this, you can see a greater degree of naturalism. All the people have bodies underneath this clothing. There's no emphasis on decorative patterning. They're just toiling away at their everyday work, supporting the aristocratic classes. The thing that I wanted to spend the most time on, because now it's a little bit familiar to us, is a double page spread, which is why it's so kind of cut down the middle here. So it would take place in the fold of the book, which is a scene from the Garden of Eden, which we looked at when we looked at the bronze doors of Bishop Bernward earlier on. And much of the subject matter is the same, and its emphasis on the fault of Eve and her temptation is the same, although here we get an even kind of clearer articulation of the sexuality of this scene. This is a type of scene that is known as a simultaneous narrative. It's a relatively new term for you. A simultaneous narrative means that within a single frame, in this case a double page spread, we have multiple different moments represented from a particular story. So there are scenes, for instance, over here on the left of Eve being tempted by the serpent, then Eve tempting Adam. Then on the right-hand side of this, we see God catching them and being angry with them. And then over here, we see the Archangel Michael in this red angel form expelling them from the Garden of Eden. So 4 different kind of scenes from the story of the temptation and the fall of Adam and Eve, all placed within the same scene itself. That's called the simultaneous narrative. Let's look at some of these up and talk about what we're seeing. In this stage, we do, with the exception of the architecture, have a greater degree of naturalism in the representation of these bodies. He's trying to make them look like real bodies, and he's using modeling and so forth. Over here on the left-hand side, remember the story. In the Bible, it goes like this. God makes Adam and Eve. He puts them in the Garden of Eden. He actually tells them to be fruitful and multiply. But then he also tells them, don't eat out of this particular tree, the tree of knowledge, or the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And after a time, Eve is tempted by a serpent into trying the apple, and then she tempts Adam into trying the apple. So the biblical story is really just a straightforward kind of transgression against what God told you to do, and going against God's word. But as this story continues to get interpreted in Western culture, more and more sexual innuendo enters into the story. Instead of it just being a transgression against God, in other words, it takes on the same flavor that I think you hear it today, which is Eve is the apple itself, and the tree is a knowledge of sexual pleasure, frankly. Sexuality is fine in Christianity as long as it produces children, but the idea of having sex for just pleasure is something that even today Catholics don't agree with. It's always supposed to produce children, which is why there are all these rules against contraception in the Catholic Church, much less so in the Protestant denominations of the Church, of course. And so if someone is just having sex for pleasure, then this is a questionable activity. And by the time that we're seeing here, it is an outright sin. That's the way they interpret it at this moment. And the story in the Garden of Eden becomes interpreted as more than just a transgression against God's commandment, don't eat out of that tree. It becomes a story that is supposed to be understood as a metaphor for women's sexuality, women tempting men into doing things that they shouldn't do, sinful things, and the fear of all of this, the fear of the sin that comes with all of this. So let's see how this is rendered in this particular work. And remember now, because we're looking at detailed paintings, kind of everything you see in these paintings is probably important. So over here, Eve is getting a piece of fruit, usually understood to be an apple, although it's not said to be an apple in the Bible, but that's the way they're interpreting it now, from a serpent. Notice really clearly that the serpent is a woman. So this is doubling down on the idea of whose fault it is. It's all woman's fault. Even the serpent is a woman here. She's got an apple in one hand, she's taking another apple. Notice how when the artist represents her form, he emphasizes the protruding abdomen here. That's a symbol of sexuality. It's also a symbol of fertility, and emphasizes, for the time, rather large breasts here. Now, notice this as well, to make sure that we know that it's Eve's fault. If we move over to this scene of Eve tempting Adam, Adam's just minding his own business. Goodness knows what he's doing, but it looks like he was kind of down here smelling the flowers or something, going about his own business, following God's commandments about don't eat out of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And here comes Eve tempting him with the apple. She is the agent here. She's the one who is the mover and the shaker, and he's just minding his own business. And also notice, and I have to say these things, otherwise I wouldn't, but that the way that he's posed Adam, you can see his genitalia here. The artist didn't need to do that, but he wants to emphasize two things. Number one, before Adam and Eve eat of the forbidden fruit here, they don't even know that they're naked. There is no sin, so being nude is not a bad thing. There's no sexuality, or rather illicit sexuality, involved in this. So he wants to show that. And the other thing is he wants to, of course, make us aware that there's something sexual that's about to occur, so he shows Adam's genitalia over here. Now, we don't see anything more than that, but we do see that the next scene, on the other side of this cool contraption in the background, which is probably meant to be a kind of fountain of life symbol, that God finds out about this, and he told them not to do it. It's frankly the one thing he told them not to do, and they're getting in trouble. He's caught them. And notice who's in the foreground again. Closest to us is Eve, and everything about God is focused on Eve. In a way, yeah, Adam's going to get in trouble for going along with it, but we want to make sure that everyone understands it's Eve's fault here in the foreground. And then they're kicked out of the Garden of Eden, this kind of earthly paradise. Their punishments are that Adam will have to basically work for a living, and that Eve's desires will be Adam's desires, which usually is interpreted that because it's her fault, Adam gets to rule over her. And also, she has a second punishment. She will have pain in childbirth, which, again, emphasizes this innuendo about sexuality. Now, also notice at this point, they're covering themselves up because they're ashamed of their nudity. They recognize that there's something sexual about this, and that at this point, sexuality has been associated with sin, and so they cover themselves up. Now moving to the Northern Renaissance proper in Flanders, so in the Flemish areas that are today Belgium primarily, which was an incredibly rich area of the world in the 15th century due to expanded trade with both areas of Africa as well as areas of the Near and Far East. And of course, Flanders has, in Antwerp and elsewhere, these beautiful big harbors that allow for a lot of boat trade that led to the explosion of the middle classes here, and a lot of extraordinary art during this period. Now, one of the first things you probably notice, and we'll talk about the period stylistics here is that this is an incredibly detailed work, and it's not even that big of a work, frankly. The center panel is a little over 2 by 3 feet. The very form of this, so to give you another term, is what's called a triptych. A triptych is a form of altarpiece. An altarpiece is set, as we remember, in front of an altar as an object of devotion that we look at when we are praying and thinking about God. And the triptych is one of the most famous forms. It has 3 separate panels, and those 3, remember, correspond with the idea of the Trinity. Here in the middle are hinges that actually allow this altarpiece to close in on itself so as to protect the paintings. So the period style of the Northern Renaissance, remember, period styles are a whole host of general characteristics of works of art produced within a particular culture in a particular time span that allow us to kind of in shorthand say, oh, that's got all the characteristics of the Northern Renaissance, and we don't necessarily need to enumerate all of them. They're a kind of starting point for art history, and remember the premise of this is that because the work is produced by a culture with particular beliefs, those works of art will reflect some of those beliefs, and those that then shows up in these general characteristics that remain the same in works of art over a particular time period. This altarpiece was created by a man by the name of Robert Campan. He was for a long time known as the Master of Flamand, and the painting itself is called the Maraud Altarpiece. It is period style of the Northern Renaissance is a really good example of this. So what is that period style, and how does it differ from the Italian early Renaissance? Well, number one, it is very naturalistic, just like we saw in Giotto's work and early Italian Renaissance works, but it has even more detail in it. That's the number one thing, a ton of naturalistic detail. One of the reasons that the Flemish artists are able to accomplish so much detail is that this is not a fresco painting, it is an oil painting. And oil paintings are quite different than the techniques we've seen so far in painting. Unlike a fresco where you're painting on wet plaster, or even a tempera painting in which the binder, the thing that holds the pigment to the board, these are all painted on gessoed boards at this stage, in which in a tempera painting that binder is an animal protein, usually egg yolks, but every once in a while they are things like animal proteins such as milk proteins and so forth. Unlike that, in oil painting, the binder is oil, usually linseed oil, which is semi-transparent. And what it allows them to do is build up layers of what are called glazes of oil. You can paint a very bold color and then go back over that color with other layers of transparent oil paint and build up the form so that you get way more naturalistic detail than you would in a fresco painting. You also don't need to paint as you would in a fresco painting before anything dries. So the big difference in the look between an oil painting and a tempera or a fresco painting is that oil paintings are luminous. They have tons and tons of light to them, lots of glossiness, just like oil paints do today. Whereas tempera and fresco paintings are very, very flat. They look matte instead of shiny and illuminated. Second characteristic of Northern Renaissance paintings is that they tend to have a very, very crowded composition. This is a complicated way of saying something simple, which is there's a lot of stuff in here that in a Renaissance painting from Italy you wouldn't find. They just fill up the entire interior with lots and lots of little anecdotal details, which the Italians try to stay away from. Number 3 is that just about everything that you find in a Northern Renaissance work, even if it seems like an object that should be in that space, such as a book or a flower pot or a candle or whatever, these things are all symbols. They're part of the iconography of the work. So a mass amount of symbols in the works of the Northern Renaissance is a common characteristic. And then number 4, and this is not in every case, but very, very frequently, these works of art oftentimes set religious scenes within a contemporary Northern Renaissance setting. In other words, we are looking at a scene, for instance, here of an Annunciation, but it's set in an interior that would look like a middle-class Flemish interior of the time. Just as if we go over here to Joseph's workshop, out through the window in the background is a contemporary Flemish city. It's probably Bruges, by the way. So those are the 4 general characteristics, and we'll pick up some of the specifics as we look through this work. I'm going to get us in close on the central panel here. Before you're starting to get familiar with this, and pretty soon we're going to do in one of our summary essays what's known as a compare and contrast essay, in which you look at 2 different renderings of the same subject, in this case the Annunciation, and you think about what makes those things different and what those differences mean. So we know the Annunciation is when the angel Gabriel comes to the Virgin Mary and announces to her that she will bear the Son of God, the Messiah, Christ on earth. And we see that occurring here. But we want to pick up what else is going on here. Why is it depicted this particular way? And the stylistics can help us to look for particular things. So, number 1, when we set something, naturalism is everywhere to be found. Let's start with this in order. Naturalism can be found in the rendering of what look like real figures in roughly believable space. Now, the artist is using a technique, he's not quite there yet, known as linear perspective, and I'll talk about this more when we get back to the Italians, and it's really in there. But linear perspective is a way to generate the illusion of 3 dimensions on a 2-dimensional surface, and you should look this up in your textbook. All of these lines, for instance, here of the bench, recede back to 1 point in space, as do these lines here at the top of the fireplace recede back into 1 space. So it creates a much more kind of believable interior. They're like converging lines, like when you're a kid and you're drawing railroad tracks going into the different distance, although in this case they all recede back to 1 point in space. There's a lot of modeling of the faces, and you can see highlights on the drapery to show you there's a body underneath this. Lots and lots of naturalism in here. Number 2 in the stylistics, tons of details, right? Everywhere you look, there's little anecdotal details, from lions up here on the edges of the bench to a candle and a book and flowers and some kind of what looks like a cleansing pot in the background, windows and a sky up here and so forth. Number 3, and this is where we have to slow down and start looking at all of this, and you need to know all of this symbolism. The cool thing is that symbolism, as long as you're within the same culture, because it's all built upon conventions of knowledge, there's nothing natural about them, but because they get used so frequently in paintings and sculptures and architecture, once you know them, you'll be able to find them everywhere, even in today's world. So while this might seem a lot to give you right off the bat, you're going to keep seeing these symbols over and over and over again, and they'll get very familiar to you. So I'm going to get us up even closer on this and show you some details. On the table in front or in between the angel Gabriel and the Virgin Mary is the Bible. And the Bible is actually kind of turning through its pages, but most of the words that are on here refer to the very passage of the Annunciation in which this is all occurring, or to the idea of purity or virginity. Remember, Mary is a virgin when this all occurs. On the table, you also see a candle. Now, single candles are very symbolic. They're just one. They're kind of like a votive candle. When they are lit, they mean that something holy or something legal is occurring. And frankly, when something's holy, it's almost always legal as well. It's all protected by law. In this case, though, you have a candle that's been blown out. We can still see the wisp of smoke. One of the things that can tell us is that the angel Gabriel has just come in on the scene, And with him came like a little bit of wind with the opening of the door, and it's blown out the candle. But the more important thing is to say that we don't need man-made light right now, because Christ, who is God's light, is coming to illuminate our lives. That's the symbol here. Snuff candle in this context means God's light overshadows man-made light. In the vase, which also has its own symbolism having to do with purity, which you can read about in your text, is a lily. White lilies are always symbols in the West of purity, in this case, the Virgin's virginity. Notice, though, that we have 3 blossoms. 3, of course, being the number of the Trinity. And to push this even further, notice how 2 of the blossoms have already opened and 1 is just still a bud. This is a symbol of the idea of God the Father, who is already alive, the Holy Spirit, who's already alive, and the Christ, who is just now a bud, but will be alive when Mary gives birth to him. So you see how prolific the symbolism is here. Go up above the table, you see flying through this round window. Remember the round window, just like the rose window, is a symbol of God's eye, looking over all things. We see flying through that window what looks like a little kind of ghost figure, carrying on his shoulder a crucifix, going on 7 rays of light. 7 is a very symbolic number as well. It's about the 7 joys and sorrows of the Virgin Mary. And what we have here is the Holy Spirit coming through the window at exactly the same moment that the angel Gabriel is telling the Virgin Mary that she will become pregnant. Now, here's the symbolism. It's about virginity, just as rays of light pass through a window without breaking it, so the Holy Spirit, or the light of God, enters Mary without disturbing her virginity. Everyone get that one? Yeah, it's a symbol of her purity, of her virginal aspect. Rays of light pass through both her and windows in the same manner to impregnate her without disturbing her virginity. In the background, in this niche, is this beautiful, beautiful pot full of water. Anytime you see clear water, it's almost always a symbol of purity, right? Like baptism is a way that Christians purify themselves in that ritual. However, in this case, it's like holy water again, but it's meant to reference something that most of you won't be aware of, but you need to for the purposes of this class. In churches, there are these little vestibules that are set up for the priest to go purify himself before conducting Mass, and they're called sacristies. This is on your lecture guide, Sacristy, a sacristy, which is a place to purify oneself. This is, of course, associated with the church, just as the Virgin Mary is associated with the church, as we've talked about before. And if this little towel here looks quite a bit like a priest's stole, that symbolic symbol of his office, it's because it's meant to allude to that. Up on the end of the banister of this kind of towel rack here is this thing here, which is kind of like a gargoyle. It's what's known as an apotropaic device, apotropaic, apotropaic, which means a symbol that is meant to ward off evil. And just about every home had these things all around it to ward off evil tidings. Then, nothing's not symbolic here. The windows are open, but they only look at the sky. This is to emphasize the spirituality of all things. And you can probably see, moving away from symbolism, how all the rafters of this roof all recede back to a central point here, showing you that perspective. I'm going to actually back up here and look around here. I'm not going to overwhelm you with symbols. We could keep going on all day. But I will say, if you're wondering about the decor here, like why would this bench go with this table? It doesn't look like it fits. Some of you probably recognize this looks suspiciously like a church pew. And so it's emphasizing the association of the Virgin Mary with the church again. Going one step further, the lions on this, both on the tops here as well as on the foot down here below, is a symbolic allusion. Illusions are things that make us think about something else, not illusion, but allusion, Allusion. It is a symbolic allusion to the throne of King Solomon the Wise, who had lion's feet on his throne. So it's about wisdom. And then you actually see up here one lit candle, a symbol that something holy or something religious is occurring. Notice how this candle holder doesn't have anything, but this one does. So those are all the symbols in here. Now let's talk about something else about this work. When we're looking at works of art, we also want to be thinking about how the form elements of that work of art work. Formal elements are things like line and shape and color and texture and space and so forth. And so one of the things that I can kind of make us think about here early on as we start to practice formal analysis is, what is the place that our eye goes first? What's called a focal point. And in this case, you'll notice over and over again, it's the Virgin Mary. Now, why does this occur? Well, one of the reasons that occurs is that the implied lines, not actual lines, but lines created by looking or pointing gestures, such as Angel Gabriel looking at him, the lines of the light coming through the window pointing at her, the hand gesture all points at her, that helps to make her the focal point. The other thing, though, that makes her the focal point is that she faces us. She's not in profile like Gabriel. She faces us, which is a much more commanding position. It demands our attention. And then number 3, she's in red. And red, with its longer wavelength, stands out a lot more than blues that seem to fade into the background here. So those all help to make her the focal point. Now, it might seem awkward that she's like sitting on the floor here, but as you will have read of in your text, this is a symbol of her humility before God. She doesn't take herself to be super important. She's on the ground, basically almost kneeling in the presence of the divine. We'll keep adding greater and greater degrees of formal analysis to our works as we go forward. Move over then to the workshop. Some things have changed. First of all, you can probably tell we don't have all the bright colors. There's not, it's a much smaller scene. It's making sure that we understand that Joseph is a little less important than the Virgin Mary, for sure, just as we saw in Giotto's work. It also focuses us in on the idea, as was in the other work, that this is almost like it's taking place in a contemporary Flemish setting, and this makes Northern Renaissance works really relatable, right? It pitches the story as if it's taking place in your world. Like, can you imagine this taking place right now in the world in which you live? And it emphasizes in Joseph's place the everyday, mundane realm, the worldly world of working hard and perfecting yourselves and doing the best you can at your job, which is part of the humanism. If Mary's work was all about the spiritual, she's the epitome of the spiritual purity idea, Joseph's the hard-working guy who epitomizes the humanistic ideal. And in the background, instead of seeing a sky, as we saw on the Virgin Mary's side, we see a contemporary Flemish town focusing on the everyday world. Joseph is rendered much more naturalistically. He's not made to look particularly beautiful. He's an everyday guy. And everywhere in his picture are symbols as well. What he's doing right now is he's drilling out holes in what is a wine press. That wine press will be used to crush grapes and to create wine. And wine is associated, as we said last time, with the sacrament of the Christian Holy Communion, that Last Supper idea where Christ turns the wine on the table into his blood and turns the bread in the table into his body. So that's one of the things going on there, symbolism. Move up to the table, and I'm sorry the slide isn't fantastic. You'll see a couple of things. Number one, there are nails up here. Now, nails would be in a carpenter's shop, but because we've chosen to pick these everywhere, you're probably thinking, and they, they're all around this table. You're probably thinking, well, that reminds me of the nails that were used to nail Christ to the cross, which is different than the ways that people were generally crucified. Also on the table is a mouse trap, and on the window, another mouse trap. Now, this is a very, very particular understanding of one of the reasons Christ came to earth that you find all over Northern Europe. It comes from a famous idea that was started in the Middle Ages, which is Christ was born, and one of the reasons he was born is that it would so pique the curiosity of Satan that he would have to come see what this was all about, and we could trap him or trap his sin. And so mouse traps became a symbol of Christ being a way to trap the sins of the devil. And you see one here and one here. And then you also see, and I'm going to back up a little bit here, displayed in the foreground, once again, in any carpenter shop, a big hatchet and a saw here. These are symbols of the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah from the Old Testament is widely considered to be by Christians the first Old Testament prophet to foretell the coming of Christ. And his symbols are the axe or the saw because he was martyred, put to death for his beliefs by being cut in half. In some of the stories with an axe, in other stories with a saw. So that's how we allude to that. If you move over that Flemish town, a little bit of a close-up, and again, this is a tiny little scene, so all that naturalistic detail out the window is something that you find a lot of in the north and far less of in Italy. If we move over to the other scene on the other side, to the left-hand side of the triptych, you see the patrons, and the patrons are the people who paid for this work of art. Now, they're not included in the actual scene, but it's like they've got private viewing of the scene, looking through the door, through which we would imagine Gabriel just went through and witnessing the Annunciation, making it very, very relatable. In the front is the man who gets to see the scene. This is the way that the gender, ideas about gender were at the time. Men were more important, so they're put in front, and the woman is behind him, looking down demurely. Remember how this corresponds with the way they interpret the Garden of Eden, for instance. In the background is a man who may or may not be the artist himself, depicting himself. And remember why people do this. It's an expiatory offering, a way to assuage one's sins during life, to expiate or wipe them away. And then finally, one last symbolism here is a walled, enclosed area referencing an expensive home. But notice this flower there. That, once again, is the hortus conclusus, or enclosed garden, an area which is filled with vibrant, lush foliage, flowers, which you can see in the foreground as well, flowers back here, but is walled off from the rest of the world. And a hortus conclusus, or enclosed garden, is a symbol of virginity. So it corresponds perfectly with the subject of this work of art. I'm going to pause for a minute and get a drink of water, and I'll be right back with another work of art from the Northern Renaissance. Okay, so among the most famous of all the Northern Renaissance artists of this period are Jan and Hubert van Eyck. They owned a huge workshop, and Jan van Eyck is probably the most famous artist of the early Northern Renaissance. You're looking at right here the very, very famous monument, an altarpiece that is known as the Ghent Altarpiece, produced around 1432, although it would have taken many, many years to produce this. It's huge. It's 12 feet tall or so. And if you saw the famous movie Monuments Men about the Nazis stealing Western artworks, this was one of the most famous works of art that the Nazis stole and was recovered after the war. It's, as I said, an altarpiece again. This is the closed version. In this case, it's not a triptych. It has multiple different panels. And when an altarpiece has multiple panels, we call it a polyptych. Poly for many, and the rest for the altarpiece part. On this scene, you can probably see already there's some things that you will be familiar with. Right in this kind of central area is a scene of the Annunciation again. And over here is the angel Gabriel, and he is speaking the words that are literally written on the surface of this, although they're written backwards, as if they could be read by God, is usually the way that people understand this. And span the space to the Virgin Mary over on this side, who is hearing those words and showing her devotion to things. In between, you see a scene of a contemporary Flemish town again, and here you see a scene of a sacristy again. And let's get up close here for a minute. Gabriel holding in his hand a lily with 3 lilies on it, saying these words, and they span the space. We're here to the Virgin Mary. And this is a new weird hat that she's wearing. This is, the Holy Spirit who has landed on her, and she is witnessing, the divine here. I think she's supposed to be looking up at him. Off to the side, you see the sacristy again. So that symbolism again is really straightforward. In a way, it's like the word of Gabriel passes through from heaven to the material realm, represented by a contemporary Flemish town. It shows up prominently in the church, just like we learned with Abbot Sujet and the Lux Nova, or idea of divine light, rays of light of God passing into the church, make it a holy space. And of course, all of this God becomes human through the Annunciation when he becomes Christ here. At the bottom, the patron saints, by the way, painted in grisaille again, these gray tones. Of the church, John the Baptist over here, and John the Evangelist over here. And then we see on each side the patrons, the people who paid for this, including themselves in the scene. Remember how this works. They're expiatory offerings meant to show God who devoted so much time and expense to glorify him and teach his word to everyone. When you open this scene up, this is what you see, and it's a massive amount of detail in this scene. And I'll keep getting us closer and closer on this, but if you think that this is Christ as God in heaven after his resurrection, if you think that this is basically life-size, you've got a pretty good idea of the scale here. It's not quite that big, but it's just about that big. And the subject up above is Christ in the center as God in heaven, blessing us all. He is associated with the Pope. He's wearing a crown that looks quite a bit like the Pope's tiara. And then down below is another crown associating him with not only the King of heaven and of religion, but the King of the earth. On his right-hand side, so made more important, is Mary, now sitting in heaven as Queen of heaven, once again reading a consecrated Bible, but now crowned. And on his left is John the Baptist. You'll always be able to tell John the Baptist because his iconography is that he'll be wearing animal furs, and he always has really unruly, unkempt hair and a beard because he was an ascetic. He was someone who devoted his entire life to the contemplation of the divine, and so he didn't care anything about how he looked. On each side of them are choirs of angels, and these choirs of angels, on the one hand, reference the idea of different orders of angels in heaven, but they are also meant to look like the choirs and the instruments that were used in the church so as to glorify God. And then on each side of them are Adam and Eve. At the bottom is something we're not going to spend a lot of time with. At the bottom is a scene of something called the Golden Mass. It's an adoration of an apparition of Christ as a lamb on an altar where all the masses, including saints and peasants and everyone, come to venerate him. Instead, let me just show you this. Let's just get up close on this, right? Looking at God here, as Jesus as God here in heaven, and you can probably tell how naturalistic this looks. I mean, everything looks completely believable, and there's tons of detail everywhere in this picture. It looks photographic, right? It's just like the most believable rendering you can imagine at this stage. And the details don't stop there. I mean, the closer you get, the more details you'll be able to see here. He no longer has a halo, but you can probably see that his head is kind of emanating these rays of light. And if you get a sense on the crown that's about this big in the picture, look at all that detail. Every single little pearl and piece of gold and jewel, all is illuminated perfectly. We've got all this pearl work spelling out words from the Bible and the glorification of God at the hem of his cloak. Look at these small little things. These are about the size of a pinhead, and they still have tons and tons of detail there. Very, very meticulous, detailed work, which we expect from the Northern Renaissance. The Virgin Mary again, symbols in her crown are the lily, a symbol of her purity, and roses, symbols of her passion for Christ. She's once again reading the Bible because she's so pure. And this is interesting. I tell you this mainly because when we get back to the Italians, and they're less interested in naturalism and much more into idealism, you won't see a representation of the first human this way at all. This is Adam, and, you know, he looks like an everyday guy. He's not made to look any better or worse than everyday people. He's just your everyday naturalized guy. When we get to the Italians, they'll want to make him more perfect than this. Eve over here, she's not holding an apple. She's holding a fig, which is another common fruit associated with the fall. And she's got the protruding abdomen, again, a symbol of her sexuality, or maybe even that she's pregnant here. And once again, we don't make her look perfect. We make her look like an everyday person, very natural. That will change with the Italian. Down below, just to show you that's a little bit based upon a mystical vision. Mystical visions are something, of course, that mystics who are very close to God supposedly have, of an apparition of Christ in the form of a sacrificial lamb bleeding into a golden chalice, which is a symbol of the Eucharist, or making his the wine into his blood, and all of the masses venerating him, because, of course, this all symbolizes our possibility of getting into heaven. Pretty quickly, know for sure, but most people are pretty sure. The text is not quite sure about this. But it stands to reason that this is a self-portrait of Jan van Eyck. And, you know, it's got all that naturalistic detail. He's wearing a red turban that's probably a symbol of him being an artist, looking back out at us, showing his consummate skill. And on when he signed this, he actually wrote on it, instead of Jan van Eyck made this, he wrote, Jan van Eyck, the best that I am able to do, which is a very, very humanistic thing. Even artists are striving to be the best artists that they can be, so that they follow God's commandment to be the best that you can be in whatever your profession is. My favorite work by Jan van Eyck is famous devil portrait, sometimes known as the Arnolfini devil portrait. Other times it's known as the Arnolfini wedding portrait, because most people think that this is probably about a wedding. The reason that this is so interesting to me is that not only is it filled with massive amounts of detail and crazy amounts of skill and tons of symbolism, but a lot of that symbolism is very gendered. It tells you what people thought about the roles of the different genders of their time. So let's start with the subject. The subject is, a very, very wealthy middle-class family. Giovanni Arnolfini, the guy, was someone who administered to the Medici banks in Bruges. So he is, and you'll learn more about the Medici family next week, and the week after, and the week after that. Frankly, they're a big family name. They're one of those really, really powerful Italian middle-class families. There's a new series on them on Netflix, for instance, that helped fund much of the Renaissance, particularly in Florence, and then later they'll vote their way into office as popes and start creating things in Rome as well. So he worked for them, and he probably made bank, right? This guy was making tons of money. And he's marrying, or we think that's probably what's going on, this woman, Giovanna, who came from a little bit lower class than him. and that's actually encoded in this work of art in various ways. Now, the portrait, if it is a wedding, is showing them in the midst of the ceremony, and one of the reasons we think that this is an actual wedding and not just a commemorative work is up here above it is Jan van Eyck's signature, and it says Jan van Eyck was here. And I'll show you a close-up of this, but this little convex mirror in the background shows the entire scene of this interior from the back to the front, as if you were seeing the entire thing in this. It's only about this big in the actual painting, from the back to the front here. And in that scene, you see Jan van Eyck, a man with a red turban, and another man probably administering the wedding. Weddings didn't take place, by the way, in churches at this time. They tended to take place in homes. And it would be particularly appropriate for this to be taking place in the most private component of the home, the bedchamber, because marriages were about uniting a couple so that they could reproduce more children, and particularly Christian children. So then let's look at some of the symbolism. We'll start with the easy stuff, and then I'll keep showing you details. Number one, first of all, I should just say all of the symbolism has to do with wealth. Everything you're seeing here is an exquisite amount of wealth, from the fashions that they're wearing, to the bed that they have, to the beautiful mirror they have in the background, to the chandelier, to this expensive kind of dog. All of this is wealth. And that wealth is symbolic of someone, doing what God wanted them to do and being rewarded for doing what God wanted them to do, perfecting themselves with material wealth. But the specific symbols, if we work our way through it, are, if you look at the chandelier, in the chandelier there's only one candle. And that candle, of course, when you have a single candle, means something religious or something holy is occurring. In this case, probably a wedding. In the foreground, I'll show you a close-up of this guy, is a dog. Now, dogs in the West are almost always a symbol of fidelity. Dogs are loyal to us. So here they are getting married, and you've got a symbol of loyalty or fidelity. But that dog has two more kind of symbolisms to it. The first is that it's a very rare breed, an Affenpinscher, which means it's about wealth again. And, of course, some of you know that dogs are pretty frisky. They can, especially unneutered males, can jump up on your leg and do all kinds of things. And that's, in the Norse, something that they playfully would have wanted people to think about. That once these two get married, they will retire to that bed and get a little frisky. And then, more symbolism. We're going to move us in closer on some of these things so we can see them better. You're probably noticing that, if you're wondering what these are their house slippers, their shoes, and here are hers in the background. They've taken these off, and every time you see someone standing barefoot, or just about every time, it's a symbol that something religious is occurring. It's called standing on holy ground, and it comes directly out of the Bible, that when you're on holy ground, you take off your shoes so as to be closer to the Spirit of God. That's one of the things occurring here. Closer here again, this mirror is small, and yet it's got all of the detail to show you the entire scene. That's the back of Giovanni, back of Giovanna, and then you see a man with a red turban and another man over here presiding over what we assume to be the marriage ceremony. All of these little scenes, and these are about the size of a dime, are scenes from what are known as the Stations of the Cross. So they're all moments of Christ leading up to his crucifixion, which is at the top. This is a signature that says Johann van Eyck for her, which means Johann van Eyck was here. On his side are prayer beads, like a rosary. And why are they on his side? Because prayer beads are used when you're out and about and you can't necessarily get to the church as often as you would like, or get to a private chapel. And so you work your way through your prayers. And that's to say, being a man, he's out and about administering to his affairs, and so he's going to need his prayer beads. On her side is a broom and the patron saint of women in childbirth right here at the top of the bed, Saint Margaret. And so what does this mean? Well, she's too wealthy to actually clean up the home, But she will be in charge of making sure that the servants clean up the home, that's the broom. And of course, her main job as a wife is to reproduce. And so you've got the patron saint of women in childbirth on her side. Right above their hands is another apotropaic figure, kind of like a little gargoyle meant to ward off evil so that they have a good and productive marriage. Giovanna, yeah, very beautiful. She's wearing everything she's wearing is of the latest style, fashionable lace, beautiful ermine trimmed green velvet cloak, all tons of wealth. A lot of people note that it looks like she's pregnant already. Well, that's the style of the time, believe it or not, to emphasize the idea of women's capability to create children. They used to have these bodices that actually protruded out from the abdomen and emphasized that. I know a lot of women today are like, why isn't that the style now? You don't have to hide any kind of belly fat or anything. It's actually seen as a symbol of your ability to bear children here. Giovanni, let's say a little bit attractive than her. The standard stereotype applies. He's got boatloads of money, and so he's able to marry the young hottie here. Looking though, like he probably looked, very naturalistic, not trying to idealize him much at all. Look at other parts of this painting. There's a few more details that are worth pointing out. On her side, the bed, very red, a symbol of passion. That's, of course, where she will be to produce children. And on his side, the open window, a symbol of him being out and about in the world, including the fruit that's on both the windowsill as well as this bench over here, a couple of which are oranges. Now, this is a weird esoteric symbol, but oranges were known as the Mala Medica, M-A-L-A, Medica, M-E-D-I-C-A, the medicinal apple. And the last part of that, Medica, sounds a lot like Medici, which is the family that he worked for, and it may be a subtle allusion to that he works for this famous family, that he wants to have that included in there. If nothing else, it symbolizes the idea of fertility once again. Notice how these are particularly right around his waist level. It's his side of the fertility complement. So tons of symbolism, tons of naturalism, lots of details in this, and of course the whole thing being gendered according to the views of the day about what each gender's role was supposed to be. Foreground, those slippers again, look at all that detail. They're actually wooden house slippers in his case and hers in the background. And the cute and Affenpin looking back out at us, a symbol of fidelity. Chandelier up above with a single candle in it, a symbol of something holy or something sacred. Something legal happening. Now, what is the other interpretation of this? If it's not a wedding, a lot of people believe it could be something that's to be almost like a visual document saying that if he goes out in the town and gets hurt, her child, this is the interpretation that she's with child already, will inherit his wealth. She wouldn't be able to. The wealth always goes through male parts of the family at this stage, but if she's pregnant, her child will receive its wealth. So it's kind of like a visual document or will in that interpretation, which is less, scholars tend to believe that less than the idea that this is a wedding. Fruit, oranges and apples. And I spent a lot of time on those works. I don't want to give you too long of a lecture. I just want to show you a few other works, and I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. One of the very famous artists of this time period is Roger Vanderheiden. In a way, Roger Vanderheiden is much more like the kind of Gothic style than some of the artists we've seen so far here, like Campan or Van Eyck, in that he tends to focus in on beautiful decorative patterning. And you see in this work called The Deposition, and there are a lot of depositions. That just means taking Christ down off of the cross. He tends to focus more on the decorative qualities than a really believable figure in space. Although all of his figures look realistic, that kind of gold weird background that doesn't seem very realistic, it's very common in his work. In this case, remember, taking people down off of the cross, taking Christ down off the cross is the moment before the lamentation scene, or a pietas scene, as we'll see going forward. And one of the things that I want to use this work to point out are the ways that the artist creates a beautiful scene out of something that's a pretty sad subject, right? And what I mean by that is not only are the beautiful colors used here all over the place, but look at Christ's body. It's not beaten and tortured. It's got a gash on the side, and it's definitely got holes here and here, but it doesn't look like it's been on a cross forever. It's had the crap beat out of him. He's made to look really, really beautiful, and he's made of this beautiful S curve, right? Which is a really soothing form. And then notice how the artist has mirrored that S curve with the same S curve in the body of the Virgin Mary, who has fainted at the scene. Now, this is really common as well. The Virgin Mary, by the time Christ has been crucified, if she was 14 when he was born, and if he died somewhere around the age of 34, she's got to be in her late 40s, and yet she looks pretty good for that. It's not uncommon to idealize the Virgin Mary all the way through this period, whether you're in the north or the south, but particularly when we get to Italy, you'll see her idealized over and over again. The other thing I wanted to talk about, though, is the iconography. There are going to be ways for you to tell who is who over and over again in these works of art, either because they're included over and over again or because they have particular iconography. So we can tell that the Virgin Mary is the Virgin Mary for two reasons. Number one, she's in blue, right? She will become queen in heaven. Number two, her body rhymes that of Christ, as if they're both from the same flesh, which they are. They're both understood to have been born of God. Because John the Evangelist will always be in these scenes, and because we know that John the Evangelist was tasked with taking care of the Virgin Mary after Christ's death, we can recognize that this is John the Evangelist. He is taking care of her more than anyone else. He's closest to her. And frankly, he's the youngest of the apostles, so that's another way to tell who he is. Over here at his feet, once more, a very, very important figure, Mary Magdalene. Remember, she'll often be at his feet crying. Her hair is all bound up. Her hair is a symbol of her sexuality. In the story of the Bible, the Mary Magdalene figure, of course, when she first meets Christ, she is understood to be a prostitute, a fallen woman, repenting her sins, and she falls at his feet and cries at his feet and wipes away the dirt from his feet with her hair and her tears. Her hair, as in all Western art, long, flowing, beautiful hair on women is a symbol of their sexuality, is something that is identified with her because she was once a prostitute. But here it's all bound up to symbolize the fact that she is penitent or repentant of her sins. But notice how her cloak falls down as if it were hair. The scarf falls down like it's hair, and she's crying there. And then right next to her, although she's not holding it, right next to her is this jar of oils that she will use to wash Christ's feet or anoint his feet during the crucifixion. Lesser characters that you don't need to remember for today, but they will show up again. Joseph of Arimathea is usually represented at the crucifixion. He's usually the one who's dressed in the nicest clothes because he was a very wealthy man. And then Nicodemus was always also at the crucifixion, and you'll see him there as an older man in less wealthy clothes than Joseph. Show you a couple steps of this. Mary has literally fainted. Yes, she's near a skull again, which is a symbol of the place where Christ was crucified, Golgotha, as well as the idea of fixing the original sin of Adam so as to give us everlasting life. His feet. Magdalene, I might also point out, look at how kind of tight-fitting her clothing is to emphasize, her body and to emphasize the idea that at once she was a prostitute, a very beautiful woman by all interpretations of this time. I'll show you again. We don't look at a lot of these scenes, but this is a work by Roger Vanderheiden called Just Portrait of a Lady. That the way that artists made the vast majority of their money was through portraiture. Here's just one of those wealthy middle-class women having her portrait painted by this man. It is, on the one hand, very naturalistic. It looks like a real figure. As your text points out, there are things that seem idealized. The full lips, the very, very almond eyes. But the only way we could tell she was idealized, because we don't have photographs of what she looked like, is to look at other Roger Vanderheiden paintings and realize over and over again he gives all of his women pretty full lips and very almond eyes. And in passing, I wanted to show you a really complex work by Roger Vanderheiden, which is known as the Last Judgment Altarpiece, which was actually created for a hospital where many people were dying, and of course, to keep them believing in Christ, they would be brought in front of this polyptych. It's a multi-panel altarpiece to be reminded that the last judgment is coming, and that they will all be judged for good and evil. It's basically set up in a pretty standard way with Christ as the judge on top. The Archangel Michael, though, in this case, is weighing the souls. He's got the scale in his hand. We've seen this going back to the Tympanum of Saint Lazare, right? And then over here on his right are the little bit more important people, including the Virgin Mary and saints and apostles and former popes. And over here, John the Baptist again, and other saints and apostles, and even Mary Magdalene over here. And then on the right-hand side are all the people being drawn from their tombs to ascend to heaven, and they're being entered into the promised realm over here that looks suspiciously like a Catholic church. Whereas the condemned, those sinners, are being cast into the fiery pits of hell over here. And I'll show you a couple of close-ups of this. And in the center, really standard iconography, the weighing of souls. If it goes up, like his hand, you're going to heaven. If it's going down, you're going to hell. Jesus sitting up above, weighing them all. Archangel, kind of his emissary. Scenes of people being cast into hell here for various reasons, dragged by their hair, screaming and crying, and finally recognizing the error of their ways, but it's far too late at this point. Whereas those who have been religious will be drawn into heaven. The work for this week is another gigantic altarpiece called the Portinari Altarpiece by Hugo van der Goes. It's a work that was created for an Italian family who was working out of Flanders again. They're actually, again, attached to the Medici family. So they had big banks up there to make money off of the trade that was in the north. It's once again a triptych, a 3-paneled altarpiece. This one's humongous. The center panel is, 8 by 12 or so a big, huge work. And the subject matter is in the center. We have a scene called, it's an adoration scene, but it's a very particular adoration scene. Again, a mystic by the name of Saint Bridget had a vision at one point, I think it's in the 12th century, of Christ lying on the ground with beams of light shooting from his body while all of the people admired him. And so instead of being in a manger or in a grotto, in Saint Bridget's mystical vision, Christ lies right on the ground to emphasize the idea of him being part of the earth, part of the very creation of God, but still, special because he's emanating all this light, while his people, his followers, circle around him and glorify him. On the left-hand side of the panel are the people who commission this, the patrons. So Tommaso Portinari is right here, and his sons down here below. Above them are their patron saints. So this is St. Thomas, and this is St. Anthony for young Anthony over here. You'll notice there's another kid in here, and he doesn't have a patron saint. And that's because this kid was born later, after the painting was already done. And so there's enough room to kind of paint his head in there, but not get the patron a saint in this scene either. Whereas on this side, same thing's going on. These are, the wife and her daughter and their patron saints here as well. In the center panel, which we'll do all of our attention on, basically an adoration scene. And just like Northern Renaissance paintings, you see tons and tons of detail, a kind of crowded composition with lots of stuff in there. Lots of naturalism. People look very, very believable, and tons of symbolism in here. So the focal point of the whole painting is, of course, Christ in the center. All the implied lines of everyone looking and pointing point towards Christ. So your eye is going to keep going back there to Christ. The second most important figure, of course, is the Virgin Mary, who takes up all of this space and is also right in the center of this picture, and so she draws our attention to her. Her hands are in the form of like a little heart that point down to Christ. You know, we do this all the time today. Lots of celebrities do this. And then as we move around the circle, hopefully you can recognize some of these figures by this point. These are the shepherds. You know, they are meant to look a little bit goofy and yokelish, frankly, because the idea is that even the low, uneducated masses understood that this is the Messiah. So you see them there. Coming in the far distance, you can't see it in this scene, are the three magi. They'll be here a little bit later. Over on this side, you have the ox and the ass again, symbols of the Old and the New Testament. I'm sorry, the New and the Old Testament. The ass is the Old and the ox is the New. And also the idea that even animals recognize Christ as the Messiah. This is Joseph, again, off to the side, not as prominent, but still in the scene. And then if you're wondering about all these diminutive figures all around, these are all angels. In this case, they all have wings, but anytime you see something that's a little bit smaller than other figures, even if they don't have wings, and frankly, oftentimes the gender or sex of angels is really hard to tell. They look very androgynous, either pretty men or, you can't quite tell who they are. That's a pretty good indicator that they are angels. So then, what about some of the symbolism? Well, the big symbolism is here in the foreground. I'll come to that in a minute, but you can probably see in the background, on purpose, in this archway of this big building that goes right over the head of the Virgin Mary. That's a symbol of, on the one hand, Mary as Queen of Heaven, underneath the dome of heaven. But you could probably barely make this out. There's also a harp here over the doorhead and the lintel. And that harp is a symbol of King David. King David is the first major king of the Israelites. And remember in the Tree of Jesse windows in the Gothic cathedrals, French monarchs in particular traced their ancestry back through the line of Mary all the way back to King David to justify their divine right to rule. And so this is associating the lineage of Mary with the Old Testament Jewish kings. In the foreground, then, these other symbols. And this is much more like the colors of the actual work. Very, very vibrant, beautiful work. You see Jesus lying nude on the ground, kind of emanating this glowing light, almost like a mandorla that you would see on a medieval tympanum. Angels on each side. They all look a little bit different because the angels come from different orders of the angels. And then very prominently displayed, and look up all the other details of the symbolism of this in your textbook. It goes into detail on this. Is a big kind of sheaf of wheat. This is all wheat. And wheat is important. It has two symbolisms to it. The place that Jesus was born was Bethlehem, that literally means house of bread. And of course, we use wheat to make bread. So it's a symbol that tells you where he was born. But wheat as well is used to make bread. And bread in the Last Supper becomes Christ's body. And Christ's body, and you can see the golden rays of light are the exact same color as the gold of the wheat here, which is also here, is symbolic of the idea that in the ceremony of the Holy Communion, you're actually taking Christ into yourself. and that emphasizes that. The wine side of this whole thing is on this particular kind of jar that is associated with medicinal use again, and Abarello is what it's called, are grapes. And so grapes are associated with the wine part of the Eucharistic ceremony. And then, of course, we have all of these flowers. Now, people have interpreted these things slightly differently through the years, but it's roughly the same. You see here lilies again, and there's two that are blooming and one barely getting ready to bloom in the background. It started, and there's Christ at the beginning of his life there. Up here, you see a purple iris. Purple irises are symbols of royalty. Down here below, you see red carnations. Red carnations, in this case, are a symbol of the Trinity. There are three of these here. Over here, the red lily, which is a symbol of the blood of Christ, the fact that he is going to die and be reborn. And then finally, you have these 7 blue columbines, and blue columbines are usually associated with sorrow. So if you think of the Columbine massacre, you might be able to remember this. And of course, Mary's going to have her sorrows in this life, as we all will, as Christ, enters life and dies for us and so forth. So that's the major symbolism of this. There's a close-up of those flowers again. And here are the scenes on the side. When you're looking this up, I won't give you the story of this, but you can figure this out pretty quickly. Over here, again, the patrons and their patron saints, except for this poor boy who was born too late. You see various scenes in the background, them leaving Bethlehem. It's a composite narrative over here. Or the 3 magi coming into the scene from the distance over here. This is the thing that I'd like you to look up. The patron saint of this woman, whose name I won't tell you, was a patron saint because of a dragon. And you see that dragon down there below. So if you want to figure out who her patron saint was, look up the saint who tamed or killed a dragon, and you'll figure that out. Well, I hope you've had fun this week. The Northern Renaissance is really cool if you love symbolism and if you love all that detail. And when we return to Italy, you're going to see a lot of the detail, although it's going to be much, much more kind of simplified versions of it, but almost none of the symbolism. The Italians didn't like the symbolism as much. So I will see you next week.